prior to joining the Arkansas, basically he was doing, as far as the Arkansas Archaeological Research Station, he was the inaugural postdoctoral teaching and research fellow in the McCormick Center for the Study of the American Revolutionary Era in Sana College in Loudonville, New York. He has also taught courses at the University of Vermont, several community colleges, and has worked as a cultural resource manager and management archaeologist. Yeah, it's really neat to actually have another fellow archaeologist, to come out here and a lot of times we'll commune back and forth about ideas and various concepts. So, he's definitely a world of knowledge, and I just want to say thank you for coming out here, Dr. Beaupre. Let's give him a nice hand. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
That's you got my long bio. Thank you. That's a nice long way of saying I'll do anything for food. I think that's a great way to talk about it. So thank you very much for the invite. I'm always happy to work here with you all and to partner with the National Park Service on my own research. And so this event, shameless plug coming up next time. This event is part of Arkansas Archaeology Month. Please, please, please check these events out. If it's okay with everybody to make sure I can be heard, I'm going to take my mask off. If that's not okay, I'll put it back on. I'm happy to do that. So please check these events out. They're all over the state. A lot of them are also having Zoom components, digital components to them if you can't make it to Fayetteville or wherever these events are happening. So check these out, and this is a great opportunity where Arkansas is very lucky, I think, in that they have one of the last true functioning archaeological surveys, where you have basically an archaeology department of 40 of us around the state that are here, and we're on your dime, right? We are state employees, and we're here to help you understand Arkansas past and archaeology and history. So please, take advantage of it and go out and do that. So, oops, here we go. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of an oxymoron, right? The future of French colonial archaeology. Future of the past. It's kind of weird, right? But the point I want you to take away with that is that we always are investigating the past, but we're reflecting a little bit about the future and the present on anything that we're doing, right? We have to think about the fact that in the present, we're looking at the past. But before I take you too far back to the past, I'm going to take you back to my past in about that 4th grade situation. No, click over there. And to my social studies textbook from about 5th grade, where you see what the social studies textbook wants you to learn about before the United States was the United States, right? We have the 13 colonies, and in a very Anglo-centric view, and a very English-written centric view of American history, we have the very nice 13 colonies laid out, and they're separated by their New England, Middle, and Southern colonies, and everything is so nice. And then we have just a blank space of purple that says Ohio River Valley, which, considering where the Ohio River Valley actually is a lot more of it to that. Oh, and then, of course, the colony of New France seems to exactly have the same outline as modern Canada, which is, kind of interesting, right? Which is not the truth about the past at all, right? This is what is fed to the children in an Anglo-centric, we're looking at the American colonies view. And there's a lot more going on pre the United States. Here's another great map of it, where we've traded up Ohio River Valley for Indian Reserve, and that has a lot to do with the British imposing the Proclamation of 1763, preserving everything west of the Appalachian Mountains for quote-unquote native people. And again, the province of Quebec seems to have a strange little lateral line, and that actually is not reflected in history whatsoever. Right? But that's what has been told to us from a very American, English language, Anglo-centric view. So let's take a look from our neighbors to the north. A map in French, they look at things a little differently, right? They're going to talk about the fact that our little piddly 13 colonies aren't even labeled on that map. They're just kind of a gray space. And instead, look at the continent of North America much more so about French interaction and French exploration and involvement with native peoples throughout the entire continent. And so there's that same line of where Ontario was in that New France first map. But that thought about the fact that it wasn't just English colonies that started North America and this kind of European expansion that had a lot to do with this huge, what we call in Quebec, the Blue Crescent, right? Where you hem in the English colonies. The downside of that is when you get to the 7 Years' War, and the contestation for the colony for the continent between England and France, there's about 1.2 million English people in the 13 colonies at that point, and only about 70,000 French people in the giant Blue Crescent. So that we were a little outnumbered by Anglophones at that point. It's just my deep background and little pains about Anglo-centric American history. Being French Canadian myself, I gotta get some political dives in there. So we are going to talk about our little corner of the Louisiana colony, and what would become Arkansas was part of the Louisiana colony at different times, and how that kind of politically was organized. And again, like I said, it's very much colored by, this got really fuzzy when I blew it up, but the corner of the Blue Crescent, or the edge of the Blue Crescent that I'm from. Right about where the top of the sea is in Fort Chambly. Fort Chambly itself is actually that star up there. But where the top of the sea is a little town called Derbyline, Vermont. And that's where I grew up. Derbyline is called Derbyline because literally the line is on a number of buildings. In our library, where I grew up, you walk in the front door of the library and then you're in the United States, and there's a line on the floor, and you get to the circulation desk and you're in Canada. And so it's one of the few international buildings like that still exist and is still open. As a matter of fact, funny story, when COVID shut the border down, which is still not as porous as it used to be, but a very close family friend of ours, half the family literally lives in Quebec and half the family in the United States, and they got together for the matriarch's 90th birthday party by throwing it on the front lawn of the library. And they invited, and the border guards, of course, are very concerned about this, and so, there's literally, they put up caution tape. Usually there isn't caution tape on the lawn, but there was caution tape on the lawn that day, and they invited the border guards for cake and ice cream and to celebrate Meme's 90th birthday. And so it was just kind of fun. Actually, it made national news, I think, because it was just hilarious to see a whole family literally waving on other sides of the border and having a party. So, I tell you all of that little background knowledge to tell you that you always have to be wary of where your information is coming from, right? I'm very colored by the fact that I am Quebecois American. I'm a second-generation American. And so my grandparents were immigrants to this country. And so when I was growing up in that border town, still in a very American New England experience, our textbooks still looked like that and still wrote the French out of a lot of continental history. And so I was colored very much by cultural upbringing of my parents and the idea that I was going to try and correct that view. And that was what I made my career about. After I left medicine, so I did start loving archaeology in 4th grade, but I started college to be a physician. And for anybody out there, looking at you smaller guys out there, I got 2 out there too. Physical chemistry is really hard. Anyway, you get to that, P-Chem, O-Chem in college, and I was like, I'm going to take this intro to archaeology class. It looks like an easy A. I've seen the Discovery Channel, no problem. And so I took this intro to archaeology class, and that's where I fell in love, and I figured I could blend that with my own political understanding of the past. So it's great. Anyway, we're here to talk about Arkansas. And the actual study of the French in Arkansas, or the search for Arkansas post, has been a center of archaeology in Arkansas since the beginning of what we call historical archaeology. Dr. Drexler here, Carl Drexler, is our station archaeologist at SAU. This quote is from the introduction of his 2016 book, that historical archaeology in its true scientific form began with searching for Arkansas post. So this has been an ongoing research project, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is not just my research. I'm standing on the backs of many, many people who have studied this in the past. And going forward, you kind of think of yourself as a custodian of that, right? So, it's actually, again, the term Arkansas Post, people think it's singular, one. That's not the case, right? Arkansas Post has had at least 5 iterations in at least 3 locations, right? Also, kind of thinking that we're always on Quapaw land as a backdrop. I have the Quapaw flag here, the Ogapa Nation flag from Oklahoma. But we have, is it going to work for me? Come on. There it goes. The number of these posts that were settled across this landscape of the Arkansas River. So we have the first one, Tonti's Post, from 1686 to 1619. It's actually not on this property that we're standing on currently, but it's down the river a little bit as part of the Ositoy unit that's also part of the National Park Service property. And it's adjoining property line as well there. It was occupied for a little while, and then they gave it up. And then they came back in about 1721, and the French reestablished the post in about 1721 in about the same location, we think, right? Well, then in 1749, and that contestation for the control of the colonies really starts to heat up. The post moves, oops, sorry, I skipped one. Oh my goodness. The post moves for the first time up to where we are now at Eclat Rouge, which is the memorial site. And then in 56, moves down toward that site we call Fort Deschamps, down in Deschamps County. As the war starts between the colonies and this push, we're going to have that idea that the post here at the memorial unit is really too far away from the confluence of the Mississippi River for being a vital military entrepot. It's got to move closer to where we're going to have a lot of convoys coming up the Mississippi River to try and win the war for the continent. Now, while the post was in that same location, with treaties of everything on this side of the river, right on the Mississippi, and so what's an important notion there is too, is while you have the post physically changing flags, it's not like everybody, not all the French people don't pack up and say goodbye and shake hands and leave, and then the new Spanish people come in, right? You have the same people that are occupying the space. And so we have to start discussing as an archaeologist this delicate interplay between now not only native and French ethnicity, but also the introduction of Spanish colonial power as well. Some Spanish individuals, and also this kind of idea of an early melting pot. Right? We talk about the melting pot of the creation of the American experiment, and that starts with this exploration. And then they get sick of being down in the muck and they move back up here to the memorial unit. Right? And this map I borrowed from my good friend Buzz, and so it has 2013, I think is when he actually drafted this map. So it's not like they closed in 2013 and everyone left. And thank you for reopening the Arkansas Post-National Memorial today. No. And then of course, while it's up there, it's Spanish back to Napoleonic French for a hot minute right after the Revolution, and old Louis lost everything from the neck up, to Revolutionary France, and to now the trifoil as opposed to the fleur-de-lis, and then to the American Post. Right. Okay. And so as I was mentioning before, this is a project that is not just my work. Looking a little frumpy after some COVID. But not just my work, but my predecessor as well. That's Dr. House next to me, which, considering our height difference, we kind of look like a before and after picture, I think. But of course, everybody who doesn't know who the gentleman on the other side is, that's Judge Arnold. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's Buzz Arnold. One of the true joys of doing a good colonial archaeology project is when the archaeologist that's working at the site doesn't also have to be the historian who's telling the story. I had the benefit of that when I was studying at Western Michigan University. A great pair of professors I got to study with, one historian, one archaeologist, that would literally get together and talk about all these issues. A lot of archaeological sites in the country, the archaeologist, the historical archaeologist like myself, has to be in the archives, working with the documents and doing all of that on their own as well. In this case, it's awesome just to pick up the phone and call Buzz, or pop over to his place and be like, hey, I got this idea, does it make sense? and have somebody who's like, well, you know, this document that I found here and here when I was in Seville, and it's really important, look at this, and this is like, okay. Punchline, but anyway. But he's a great, great partner to work with. And so it's that kind of custodial looking at archaeology across the state of Arkansas. And somebody who's lived in Arkansas his entire life as well and has a lot of that information. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to where we're at with archaeology in each of these places right now and what I'm aiming to look at for the future. So we're going to start at Tonti's Post right there. We're going to start at the beginning. Whoops. There we go. Fascinating guy, by the way. Literally has a hook for a hand. How cool is that? Has a hand blown off when he is in Italy. I think he has a, they say a grenade mishap. I'm pretty sure he was holding the grenade when it went off. And so there's no more hand. But he wore a metal hook with a leather glove over it. Really kind of swarthy guy, not noble, not born noble. His father, I think, was a merchant. You ever heard of a tontine, that kind of insurance policy where everybody invests money together as a crew, and then the last person that survives gets all the benefit of the investment? That supposedly was his father that invented that. Really cool story. Don't know if it's true, but it's a neat story. But he is LaSalle's right-hand man. Kind of funny because he didn't have a right hand. Oh, but he's LaSalle's right-hand man. And unfortunately, you know, after LaSalle makes his little boo-boo and misses the Mississippi River and ends up dying at the hands of his men in Texas, he's kind of in charge. But it was on a relief mission coming down this area that Tonti is trying to meet LaSalle on his way back up the Mississippi, and instead he decides that he's going to found his trading post. And this has been looked at for a number of years. Dr. House discovered what we think is the first location of the Arkansas Post as part of a training program in partnership with the survey and some other folks, and has published on this. And also in association with that, near the Osatoy unit, actually on a private piece, or this is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife property, there's also a site called Lake Dumont, which is a cemetery site, an occupation site, looking at that early contact. Fascinating stuff that's been done in the past. And as we go forward, looking at working with the Quapaw people who approved this excavation and were involved in what we call NAGPRA repatriation, so removal of Native American remains, human remains, and reinterring them. But looking at now the fact that what's been published up to this point has been the really interesting archaeology in the burials where the occupation site archaeology really hasn't been investigated. Dr. House's shtick wasn't French contact stuff, it was Native American stuff. And so I've started going through this collection of artifacts that, not from the graves, but from the occupation layers, and taking a look at whether we're really looking at right at this date where the burials and the people living around them are the same time or different times. And that's what's really, really interesting, because we see these sites, these archaeological sites, being used at a number of different times because it's a great place to live. You're going to go back to a great place to live. You know, when you're done living in your house, it's not like nobody ever's there again, right? So that's still ongoing work. And there's, you know, a lot of pieces to pull together in looking at a lot of these sites that are together on the Osatoy unit and trying to figure out what the puzzle pieces are actually telling us. There's the Menard Mound site complex. How does that relate to the French occupation, to this involvement, right? And when we're looking at this first post, I love this. This is another, I stole this right out of Buzz's book, this other quote. Tonti himself, one of these is a projector button. Was it like a, yeah, there we go. When Tonti himself is talking about founding the post, it's really because he has a congé. He has a trade license to control the fur trade in the area, right? And he's been given a lordship, right? He wasn't born noble, but he's been given a lordship in Arkansas by LaSalle as a thank you. Here you can have the trade for this area, and I'm going to make you Lord of Arkansas, right? And he would actually sign letters. The seigneur of the city of Tonti on the river Arkansas. I'm the lord of this place, right? I have this now nobility. Not to mention that the city of Tonti was a trading post that never had more than like 6 guys. Not exactly a city, right? It's not like they're building a monorail. But the fact that, you know, he wanted to establish this notion, and really what's the establishment that actually takes place is let's start looking at serious partnership with the local native people, right? As opposed to, oh, hey, I'm just paddling through and beads for some pelts or whatever. We're going to start building a post where there is going to be constant communication and interplay between native culture and French culture at this point. And that's some of the really interesting stuff that we still need to pick out of the archaeological record, right? And we can look at the artifacts and analyze them in such a way to investigate that. We're going to talk more about that when we get up to the second Arkansas post. About the same location, we think, and had a lot to do with John Law's colony. Fascinating guy with the Mississippi bubble, right? It makes the subprime mortgage situation look like nothing, right? Selling individual stock options in this colony that he's going to have this big, absolutely massive, agrarian colony. It never comes to be, right? He's selling stuff that doesn't exist, which is just really, really cool when you think about it. At any rate, the French government does establish a military post there to support the colony, but there's a lot of this little interplay that just end up as footnotes in a historical text somewhere that they have really interesting human stories behind. And that's where the archaeologists pick up from the historians. I mean, we could be fascinated. Buzz's work is wonderful, and just sit down and look at, okay, here's what Buzz has to say about this whole interplay, or any historian looking at this thing. But what gets me is like, even before the German settlers were supposed to come with Law's colony, they sent indentured servants and slaves ahead of time to start getting the fields ready, to start setting up the colony. And that story hasn't been told, right? Those people are affecting the landscape. They're going to be doing slash and burn agriculture. They're going to be building houses. They're going to be living in the colony, and that story isn't told in the history books, right? What we do as historical archaeologists often is try and tell the history for those people who haven't had it written down, right? We're looking at the subalternate history. We try to be a great leveler in archaeology. And what I always tell my intro class is because no one edits their trash. That's why archaeologists can do this, right? Because you don't think about what you throw away. And I have spent a very long time in college to be a glorified trash picker, right? That is what I do. I love telling people that because it's the truth. I dig through people's trash to try and figure out how they live their life. And so there's a lot of this story that's left to be told. And one of the great ways to do that, here we go, is looking again at this interplay of the multiple sites and looking back at the one Wallace Bottom site where we think the first colony was, but looking at some really interesting trash, right? In this case, what is the trash?
Bones.
Bones. Yeah. Not human bones. That's not what I do. These are animal bones, right? So it's the leftover meals, right? And so this is ongoing research right now. This was a picture I took before I shipped up a whole bunch of these remains to our faunal analyst. We, as archaeologists, are very multidisciplinary. We have to be. And we work with different specialists in the field. We have a zooarchaeologist, a faunal analyst that we work with, or that I work with, named Terry Martin, who this is what he does, is French foodways through animal bones. Everywhere across North America, he's hired as a consultant to do this. And he just happens to be one of my old professors and buddies, and so he does it pretty much gratis for me, which is awesome. But we can take these samples and we can see, hey, what bones end up in the archaeological record? And not only, okay, we can infer people are eating stuff, but what are they eating? And where are they getting what they're eating, right? I love the fact that pig is coming up in here, right? No wild pigs before European colonization, so they're bringing pigs in. Now, how do you bring a pig to Arkansas? Or how do you get pig in Arkansas? A couple of different ways, right? You can either bring it alive, which I love the idea of thinking about like a piglet in a canoe being and a calf hog-tied and put in the bow of a canoe and for like, days as you paddle up the river. Or is it coming as prepared food? Is it coming as dried or smoked or jerky of some type, right? Is it coming as preserved? We can start asking these questions, not only by the fact that the animal bones are there, but we can start looking at what bones, right? And so when we look and we have, there we go, the teeth of a cow,
You're not preserving a cow's head and bringing it. You probably had a cow. If you've got a cow tooth, you've got a cow. Or you've got somebody who likes collecting cow teeth, which is kind of weird. But starting to look at these ideas, again with the pig, you got a whole bunch of pig teeth, right, and cranial fragments of pigs, right? You've got pig heads, you're not preserving that. It's not salted pork that includes teeth, and this is really bad salted pork. So we can look at something that's like this trash and ask these questions. This is hot off the press, or as Terry would say, hot off the keyboard. This is the brand new analysis that we just got last week. And Buzz and Terry and Dr. Scott, who is my associate at the UAPB station, myself and Dr. House are all working together to write an article about foodways at Wallace Bottom or at Arkansas Post. And the question also is up for grabs is the Wallace Bottom site Arkansas Post number 1, Tonti's Post, or is it Post number 2? And some of this information is telling us that the remains that were pulled out for this feature with these animal remains leaning us much more toward Arkansas Post number 2 than number 1. So we can still kind of keep questioning what we're looking at and investigating. I'm going to pop up here to the memorial unit. Really interesting idea that came up with Buzz and I was this is a map from way later, 1832, but it's got this little notation. It's actually a priest who came through in 1832. Has this little notation on it. Here we are in the post proper, right? And then across the river, there's a little peninsula here. And it says a completely flooded point where Spanish fort was previously located. And from talking from Buzz, he thinks it's actually a misnomer, that the priest was saying it should have been the French fort and not the Spanish fort. But there may be a whole other post that's underwater out there that we don't have indication of archaeologically. So there it is again, it's blown up. The screen is so big, it looks so much smaller on my laptop. But take a look at your modern satellite imagery. Here we are in the visitor center, and here's the point and where the river is now. I had a really, really steep learning curve when I moved down here from the north about the fact that your rivers down here, they walk around. They like seriously meander. Like, I always thought of meander as a nice pleasant word, like, you know, you're paddling your boat and you're meandering on the opposite of the river. It's a little bit more violent down here. And so you can see, we even just something as simple as Googling it. You can see here's the topo map from the 1930s of what the post looked like in the 1930s before the dam and the flooding, right? And on that map, I've highlighted here in blue, here's what the proposed meander was from 1816 to 1820, I think it is, and it changes 1830 over here, 1820. And so we can look at that and try and piece this together of where the post might be. And so if it's out here, and the way that the site looks now, it's probably long gone underwater. Another funny thing, Teresa's predecessor and former colleague here, Eric, had been the interpreter for many years. Probably some of you know Eric. When he first brought me on a tour down here, I was like, kind of saying fresh off the boat is a funny way to say it. But I was just came down from my home in Vermont, and we're standing here looking out at the backwater and the river. And he's like, you know, there's the Civil War fort is out there, and you know, we don't know if there's another French post out there. And I was like, that's no problem, you just do GPR. And he looked at me and he's like, how would you do ground penetrating radar underwater? And I was like, you don't do it underwater. You do it on the water. You wait for the river to freeze in the wintertime, and then you do like everybody else does. And you run your GPR over there. And I wasn't trying to be funny. Because we do that in Michigan, we do that in Quebec, we do that in Vermont, no problem. You wait for it to freeze and you run the GPR right at the top. Because you're a nice, clean, crisp image, because once you get the static of the ice out of the way, you get a nice view of the bottom. Better than sonar, you know, and you're like, oh, this is great. And he looked at me, and he just stared for a minute. And I was like, river doesn't freeze, does it? And he goes, no, Arkansas. Right, Arkansas, no freeze. And he's like, let me go show you the gator. And I was like, okay, we're good, I'm good. I'm good. Come on. So anyway, jumping back down to Deshay, really, really interesting questions there again about your wandering rivers, and brings us right back to that fact that we moved down, or the site moved down to Deshay because the clash for control of the colony was taking place, and it was time to have the military might of Arkansas Post, if you can ever really say the military might of it, but closer down to the confluence of the Mississippi. Because we had to be worried about empire, right? We had to be worried about empire. Well, because of our lovely history of the Arkansas post. Fort Deschutes was actually recorded by the initial Mississippi Mound Survey of the Arkansas River Valley by the Smithsonian, right? And the great study that was done by Palmer, going around and looking at this 1880s, looking at the mounds and recording them before they were all wasted away, the ones that were still left by agriculture. And so this is the sketch that came out of that initial ethnography survey of what the French fort looked like and the turn of the 20th century. And so it was located and put on a map. Here we have our maps that we keep for the state records of the Fort Deschutes site right on the river, which again is a really interesting question, because when you look at the drawing, you can infer that there's a river down here, but it seems like there's kind of a bigger gap in space, and it's a very poor drawing. The interesting thing is the original of this is not to be found. The original drawing doesn't exist as far as we know so far. Only the published version of the drawing is out there. And so, again, thinking, okay, let's look historically. We have this site recorded on the 1972 map, which had been the standard for the Arkansas Archaeological Survey to use to record archaeological sites. It's kind of what we do. We take care of these sites. And we have it because of this gentleman, who is a local artifact collector, right? And he found it himself scouring the bank and pulling up just an amazing collection of 18th century French artifacts. He had worked with my predecessors, John House, and also Bernie McClarkin, who had been at my station, and Skip Abernathy as well, to go out there. And here is taken from an aerial photo taken from a crop dusting plane that Skip knew a pilot, somehow they got him out there. And the site was supposed to be right along in here. Now, if you look at that same piece of property now on the satellite image, it's gone. Whole thing, whole spit of land has been eaten by the river, right? So let's look at it again historically. Here's these historical maps, 1939 Big Island. You take that same geographic location from the 1972 map and you drop it. The USGS is a great tool to do this. You drop that same geographic location and here's what the area looked like in 39. And here again is that river meander from 1820, where the river was then. The location in 39, right, and there it is in 39 again. And then in 56, river's getting closer. And then by 72, that whole peninsula sticking off there has been cut off by the river, just this oxbow coming straight around. The last time anyone from the Arkansas Archaeological Survey visited Fort Deschutes was 1986. And that was John House and Bernie McClarkin and Buzz all jumping in a truck and driving this woods road, the levee's back here, the woods road through paper company land and out to find the site. And they said they got as close as they could before the river was flooded, before the road was flooded. When you look at the location now on the satellite imagery, I'm thinking this is inferring of where it probably is. And I got really excited. It looks like it's on dry land now. If anything is left that had been left by the river scarring and creating this huge oxbow, it might still be out there. And so my first focus in studying the Arkansas archaeology, Arkansas post-archaeology, was I wanted to put a section of it to bed. I arrived here knowing that the site was pretty much destroyed by the river, and I was like, but I gotta make sure, before I write that article and talk about its destruction, I gotta make sure it's really not there. Because you don't want to be that guy, right? You don't want to be the guy that's like, nah, it doesn't exist, it's gone, don't worry about it. And then you're like, but I found it. And it's always a kid who's like, look. And I'm like, no! Anyway, so this is last week. And this is us attempting to get out there on the woods road. We made it to about 7 miles from the site. And this is what we got. Standing on a levee road that was made of concrete, that was just further down here. They're massive boulder-sized pieces of concrete, so we couldn't drive on the levee road. And this is us standing, that's actually Dr. Drexler, my colleague Dr. Scott, another one of our volunteers, looking down. There's about a 15-foot drop here off the levee road. You can't really tell from this photo, but of the woods road that we had been driving that is now under about 3 feet of water. Yeah?
Would LiDAR be able to help
It would be. Now, the other great thing about the preservation of a site like Fort Touché is that when you get, let's see if we got a bigger image of the map. When you get down around this section of the Arkansas River, south of here, where all the traffic has been taken in the canal over to the White, there is a whole lot of nothing going on down there, right? Now, or probably for the last 200 years. Whole lot of nothing. It's not an area that has decent enough finite LiDAR in existence currently. It is one of our ideas to go out and to get a LiDAR survey of that area, an aerial LiDAR survey of that area with a fine enough resolution to see if there's anything left. I haven't gone down that road because I think it's gone. But yeah.
What is LiDAR?
Ooh, what is LiDAR? Really good question. LiDAR is light detection, imaging, and ranging. Light imaging, detection, and ranging. Spell it LiDAR. It's actually, it's a really cool, kind of think of it as a aerially mounted laser beam that where you fly over an area and you basically make like a scan of the ground surface. And the lasers are at such a resolution that you get through and you can pull off the layers of information that are of like tree canopy, and you can actually see the ground. Really cool stuff's been done in like the jungles of Mexico to find Mayan temple sites, where it would take you decades to go through the jungle to find this. You fly over and you're like, they've used it immensely well in the UK, finding hill forts. Iron Age hill forts is a big one where they had these massive earthworks that have now been plowed flat for centuries, and they're just undetectable at the ground surface from the air with the lasers. You're like, oh, there's a giant circle, and like it's really, really cool. Really, really cool. So it's an option. It's an investment that I'm not ready to make, but I don't think it's there. So that is, talking about ongoing research, that's still, I can't finish this article and put it to bed until I try and get out there. The next plan is next week, before it gets too leafy, to take a boat across the river and go in that way. Cool. And so, honestly, the best place to see Fort Touché is at the Touché County Museum. In the back pole barn room where they have like their Singer sewing machine collection, this gentleman donated a huge portion, well, I hope it's a huge portion, I don't know how much of his collection is still in private hands, but the best collection of French material culture in the state of Arkansas currently is there. It's in a small case in the back of the museum, and they have all this great hand-painted, what we call faience. It's really neat, different pottery than we have now. It's tin glazed, so the glaze that sits on top of the clay kind of looks like an M&M, like you can flake it off. It's kind of cool, like you flake candy off chocolate. But it was the common use by French folks, and the same with this green glazed earthenware. Really, really cool stuff. And this was just literally, me calling ahead and them opening the case for me and letting me take photos right there on a piece of velvet in their lab. Bottles from his collection, again, this white and blue faience, beautiful, beautiful artifacts to take a look at, to see that you can actually connect with the people that lived here a couple of hundred years ago. And other cool thing about my job is that sometimes I'm doing archaeology without leaving my office, in that there is some really interesting data that's been collected in our office for decades that no one has looked at. And in this case, we had a slide that said lead bale seal from Fort Touché in a big binder of slide film. And so once I slide scanned it and cleaned it up, it's an absolutely gorgeous image of what we call, we used to be called a bale seal, now we just call them lead seals. This would be on a bolt of cloth that was brought up for trade. And it was this measuring 17.5 ounces, which is kind of like a square measure of fabric, like a yard. And so really interesting tie. It came from Fort Touché, and we have, thanks to Buzz's work, historical documents of the soldiers stationed at Fort Touché not being paid in specie, not being paid in gold, but being paid in fabric to trade to the native people for any of their own personal needs. So there's a direct tie in this artifact between the historical record and the artifactual record, and trying to build that life of people in the past. Again, not a piece of information I would have ever had about being paid in cloth without Buzz's work and without a relationship with a serious historian like that. Popping up here to the final kind of station post, thanks to the fact that the new superintendent is an archaeologist, it's awesome. We start talking about looking at parts of the post that really haven't been investigated and asking questions, and we can do it now with things like LiDAR and ground penetrating radar and resistivity and magnetometry that doesn't cause a lot of damage to the ground, right? And so working up here at the memorial unit, the plan is to go forward, and the first thing we have to do is really, because the focus of archaeology, historical archaeology in Arkansas had been Arkansas Post, a lot has happened down here in the old town site. And a lot has happened all around. You have those nice interpretive trails now you can walk around. We know where we think the locations of each one of these sites are, and these have been excavated archaeologically, all before I was born. Right? All of this work has taken place, and it needs to be reanalyzed, because in 1971, the archaeology and the way that historical archaeology in 1971 was done is nowhere near the way it's done now, 50 years later. We only really talk about the birth of American historical archaeology in the 1960s. So this is really kind of on the cutting edge of work that happened here in Arkansas. But something as simple as all these collections from these excavations, a lot of them are on agreement with the National Park Service. They're housed at our curation facility in Fayetteville. I went up there with a student the other day who was working on a master's with these folks down here, and I brought her up into the archives, or our back artifact collections rooms, and pulled a couple boxes to get artifacts that she wanted to analyze for her master's thesis. Something as simple as me picking up a bag and looking at the artifacts, and what the artifacts were in the bag, and how they were labeled, and how they were labeled on our inventory chart, and me looking at them being like, that's not this. Because in 1971, sure, it was that. That's what we thought it was. But something as simple as pipe stems, the white ball clay pipe stems, you see them out here in the case. We have some of them on display from the Walt's Bottom site, being labeled as bone or other things because people just didn't know what they were. Right? So archaeology is often archaeology of itself and going back and reanalyzing. Before we put a shovel in the ground in the town site again, we need to get a hold on what we have and the information that we know or we think we know. Right? But I'm really interested in the fact that there's architecture out there, and there's great historical documentation of that architecture, even like the piece written by Washington Irving about visiting Arkansas Post and talking about, it's kind of, it's allegorical, it's a little fantasy, it's Washington Irving, and the guy wrote about the Headless Horseman. But the notion that the architecture is out there, and just borrowing from, in this case, Prairie du Rocher in Illinois, and that style of architecture, or down in, or up, I guess, from here in Colonial St. Genevieve, Missouri, and looking at that architecture and trying to figure out what the houses look like here. And I was just reading one of these reports again the other day, I think it was the 1971, talking about how they had a flood at the end of the field season. And when they had the flood at the end of the field season, they opened up the last units in the only spot that was dry during the flood. The Little Rise. Well, people of the past weren't stupid. They were different than we are. They made different choices. But everything that flooded in 1971, where do you think the people that built the house? The part that wasn't flooded in 1971. Last unit that was opened up, and it was literally at least 2 or 3 houses that had been built in the same location on top of one another. And the end of that report being like, well, hey, it was the end of the field season, don't know what it was, had to cover it back up. It's like, we think there's houses there. It's the only good house architecture we found this year, and there it is. We'll go back to it. And they never came back to it, right? Those questions are still out there to investigate. Outside of the post proper, when we're looking at the Arkansas Post itself, it's not just the town, but what was also called the Habitant Coast, or these individual plantation houses, farmhouses outside of town, along the river. And there's historical quotes about that, talking about the number of houses scattered about, and how the French were practicing the same style of agriculture and divvying up property, long lot agriculture, that they did in most of North America where they colonized. And they were splitting up the land in their style, and those indications are still out on the landscape. Even so simple as the way that the sections are on the modern maps follows those Spanish land grants, which are recorded as Spanish land grants, a lot of them, come on, a lot of them were, there's the Spanish land grants, quote unquote, a lot of them are more indicative of French-style land grants, and you can still see them in the way the property lines go. This is, you know, an open image you can find on acre value about the property in this area, right? Here we are over here. And so these houses, if they hadn't been eaten by the river and its numerous movements, there is a lot of information out there about the way people are living outside of town, which also gains us access into the possibility of the way that enslaved people are living at Arkansas Post, because that's a consideration we have to think about. Those people whose history hasn't been told by the written documents are often those that history needs to be told. And so we can gain access to some of that information through archaeology. There we go. And here's an example of that same long lot agriculture just outside Quebec City. Here's Quebec City and the St. Lawrence River that comes up, the Ile de Oleon, and the fact that my name is one that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, but in Quebec, it is a Quebecois name. It's what we call a dit name, and it's the Côte de Beaupre. This is where my family is from, actually, right on this riverbank, in that same style of agriculture. It's just a shameless plug for my history, personally. But anyway, we can see that pattern. We see it here. We see it in the French colonies in upstate New York. We see it, you know, in the metropole of Quebec. We see it in Louisiana. Go down and look at the river in Louisiana, the way the parishes are organized. Right? It's that same way, and that same pattern is here. We can investigate. And so, one of those, I mean, sometimes it's as simple as like cracking open an atlas. Over down, there's the Notrib's Bend recreation area. Notrib, like Frederick Notrib, whose house is out here, he had a townhouse, and he had a country house. He had a plantation house. And out in his plantation house is why Notrib's Bend is named Notrib's Bend, is that was his plantation area. And this site is recorded in our site files as belonging to the Army Corps, and it's recorded because of, you know, this file goes on to say, because it's labeled on the map there, and I think they said they found one glass bead there or something. It's not real archaeological significance, but it's there. We think it's there, and you gotta kind of find it, and that'll be a way to kind of access and tell that story. Again, being multidisciplinary in archaeology and multifocal, we have to work in partnerships. My partnership with the historian, partnerships with the National Park Service. This would be partnership with the Army Corps. Also, when you look at the same around the Osito unit, you have private landowners there, you have other public landowners, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And I showed you a lot of these site locations because a lot of it is well protected, and it's well out there, and people are out there to protect it. And we want to know what is in the archaeological record without damaging it further, but also with the eye that the river's gonna eat it. And so that whole study of just literally what shows up on the map as one blip of Arkansas Post. We have to think about how Arkansas Post related, even all 7 of them, or whatever it is, related to all of the other posts that are occupied along this Mississippi River system at the time. It's not about one place, it has to be about interplay. Interplay at the same location between native and French, or colonizers, or Spanish, or American, or whoever, and then how all these sites play together to tell that story of literally a part of the map that was completely disregarded by your middle school or high school textbook. Right? And so, please, thank you for listening, thank you for your time. Take a look at these Archaeology Month events. There's stuff all over the state, and I am happy to answer any questions you have. Yeah?
Someone told me once, you know, the way the Spanish land grants laid out, they were long and narrow, but it gave everybody access to water.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that's the same way, that's that style of, we call it the seigneurial system, which is the wrong term to use for it. Seigneurial system is actually the political organization of French feudal lords, but long lot agriculture, and you're absolutely right. It's so that everybody had access to the river, because the river's your highway. It's just like having a curb cut. Every business needs a curb cut, right? Every property needs an access to the river, because you're moving everything on the river. You're bringing raw materials in, you're bringing finished materials out, everything is going that way. So if you had a piece of property that's cut off from the river, then you have to negotiate with your neighbor to travel through his property to get to the highway, right, to get to the river. And so that's exactly right. Those long lots are all divvied up that way. Yeah?
will you be able to return in the summer when the water's down to go back to the Fort Deschamps site? Or
That's the plan. So I want to get, if I can get to it, if it's flooded when the water is high now, why I really want to go in high water, which seems counterintuitive, but why I really want to go in high water is if it's underwater now, there's no point in going back, right? It will have been scoured at least by the last 35 years of river movement. And any kind of archaeology that's intact is going to be gone. There may be artifacts left, I doubt it, but there may be artifacts left. And it's not the artifacts that we're after, but it's the layer we call the archaeological context about the artifacts and the interplay together and archaeological features. I think it's going to be all gone. If we can go out there, if there's any indication of it being dry, going back in the other flip side of that is when you go when it's dry, everything is leaved out. So you have to be able to locate it as best you can with no leaves, and then go back and try and do it. Benefit of it is with the GPS technology we have now, finding stuff pinpoint is really interesting. But we can use modern GPS technology now to find stuff. But the map from 1972 is not exactly at that same level. So it's one of those ongoing gnawing questions that I have to get to. It can't be that guy. It can't be that guy who says it's gone and then it's still there. It'd be like if somebody found Napoleon, the city of Napoleon tomorrow. It'd be like, no, it's just not right. Anything else? Any of those? Well, I'm happy to stick around, and thank you for listening. You've been a great audience.